So I'm going to talk to you about how much does it really cost to do an engine swap, and is an LS swap really that much cheaper than everything else? You see a lot of stuff on the web, on internet forums. Everyone's always like, just do an LS swap, it's so much cheaper. And the question is it really that much cheaper? Especially when you're trying to retrofit an old car with a bunch of new stuff. There's a bunch of extra equipment that usually goes into an engine swap when you're updating an engine to something more modern that is difficult to account for and is often overlooked when somebody says, oh, it only cost me $600. There's, I don't know how many YouTube videos out there that are like $1,000, $1,200 turbo LS swap, or $200 4.8 liter LS makes 430 horsepower or whatever. And you know, there's more to it than that. So I'm going to go through you my cost of rebuilding the engine for the Impala, as well as some research that I've been doing in terms of putting a new engine in the C10 pickup. And I'll tell you what I know, and you can use my information to apply to your information, and I will be as absolutely transparent as possible. I will be giving you some data, lots of data from my own analysis in this presentation and in this video, so please follow along. I will show you some graphs and things like that. The first one is my original goal from 2 years ago. I did some analysis where I was looking at swapping in a crate 350 motor, a 4.8 liter LR4 LS motor, a 5.3 L59 LS motor, a 383 crate engine. I was also looking at eBay parts for LS1 and T56 combinations that were coming out of Camaros. The GM Performance Parts ZZ5, the Fast Burn 350 from GM Performance Parts, LS2 T56 combinations out of Pontiac GTOs, and an Edelbrock supercharged E-Force crate motor, as well as a ProFlow XT crate motor. And all those, I was just trying to get some sense of, you know, what's the relationship of horsepower to cost, and what could I make my 283 become? And I was still kind of on the fence about whether or not I was going to include the 283, but I decided to stick with it because it was the original engine in the car, not because I want to have a numbers matching car or that I think it's going to make it worth more someday. It was the original engine from when my grandfather had it, and when I drove this car when I was 17 years old, it was the motor that was in it. So that's kind of why, that nostalgia is why I wanted to keep that 283 in it. I had some original goals at the time. I wanted the original engine, but I wanted a manual transmission because I wanted it to be fun to drive. I wanted electronic fuel injection. I wanted something around 400 horsepower, and I thought I could do all that for less than $10,000. And this chart is what ended up coming out of all that study, and I'll put the picture up here so you can see it. You can see in there that my 283 with EFI and the supercharger was estimated to cost me about $9,500, and I thought I could put a 283 with a carb and a supercharger in there for somehow around $7,000, which was just silly. I don't know, this was 2 years ago, so I think it was before I took it into the engine shop at Wasserbeck Speed Shop to get it rebuilt. So I wasn't even looking at, you know, what does it cost to give this thing forged internals. I was also looking at comparisons for other stuff. I was trying to figure out what's the cost per horsepower. Can I use that as sort of a gauge in terms of what a swap might cost? And I was looking at all these different LS motors on eBay and different crate motors and things like that. And of course, when you get a 0 mileage motor, you have a lot more cost per horsepower because you're paying for something that's brand new or completely rebuilt, versus when you get an engine that has between 25,000 and say 120,000 miles on it. An interesting relationship was that was pretty flat. Now you could look at this data and you could say, well, there's a little bit of an upward slope at it, which would be counterintuitive. You would think a lower mileage engine would be a cheaper engine, which is true. But then once you get into it, if you're going to modify it, you're going to put heads on it, put a cam in it or whatever, you're probably going to get in there and rebuild a lot of stuff. So you're going to spend more money getting that engine back up to something that you could rely on. A lot of these projects that we see on the web, like old CarCraft articles or Hot Rod articles, they're just taking like 130,000, 150,000 mile junkyard motor and just throwing turbo and bolt-ons on it and stuff like that, which is great. But getting a higher mileage engine will save you some money. But if you want to work it up to 375 horsepower, you're going to have to throw more money at it. Interesting thing, if you looked at the stat costs of what I was trying to analyze back then versus what's available today. I mean, this is only 2 years ago. Again, I was targeting $10,000, but I had LS1 and GTO options on the list. Those aren't really on eBay that much anymore. I mean, you can search for them directly and find a few, but they're hard to find, and they're higher mileage now. Aluminum, all aluminum 4.8 and 5.3 engines are hard to find now if you want aluminum. But you see a lot more Gen 4 and Gen 5 LS motors on eBay now than you used to. And you also have another added cost to consider, and that's deleting displacement on demand, because a lot of the new motors, I think past like 2011, have displacement on demand programmed into them, and they've got hardware on them, and so you have to delete that, which is an extra kit. You know, it's an extra $200 or $300 to think about. If you also look at my 2 years ago, I was just analyzing all this. I thought, okay, if I could achieve something around $26 per horsepower, I'm going to be in a great place. I wrote a blog on all this, and I'll put the link in that down below, where I was like, oh, I'm going to save myself a ton of money. I'm going to have the best bang for my buck out of this 283, and it's going to be great. And you're going to find out that I was wrong. But you can see here that, you know, with the intention of swapping over a T56 into this car, I was hoping I could get under $26 per horsepower, and I don't think I achieved that. Why was I looking at T56? Well, you can see in this pricing, I was looking at all kinds of options. I was looking at Muncie M22 4-speeds. I was looking at BorgWarner T5 world-class transmission. I was willing to accept even a 4-speed or 5-speed if I could get a low top gear on the car for highway cruising. That's really all I wanted it for. But when I started analyzing the gear ratios of these different transmissions, I started to see why a T56 is so great. First of all, it's one of the only junkyard transmissions that'll take over 400 horsepower. It'll give me the good fuel economy I would want and low engine RPM, just in terms of combating drone on the highway that I was looking for. And if I looked hard, I might be able to find one for less than $2,500, but I would have to look really hard. And it took me about 1.5 years to finally pull the trigger and buy a transmission. And even then, I had troubles with it, because the first one I bought, I thought I got for a deal, and some dude was just trying to steal money from me on eBay. Finally got that back and went out and found another one, and that's the one I've got now. So check out this plot of gear ratios. If you look at engine RPM versus vehicle speed, you can see why the T56 is so awesome. It just spans, all these lines are basically a bunch of linear course fits to what you would like to be a continuous map. You know, a CVT would be able to cover any spot on this map, but a 6-speed gives you more options to do it. This is why vehicles are moving towards more and more gears in their transmissions. So the new Camaro that I had test drove, the 2017 Camaro, I think I put a link up here, right there. That Camaro had 8 speeds. And so it's trying to cover this map as efficiently as possible. And what that allows you to do is you can get away with a high gear ratio in the rear end. So if you get like a 410, which would normally be unstreetable, now you can have it, and it gives you that kind of launch and good torque at the bottom end that you really like, and you can still have your highway economy too. So that's why T56 was great. And so after looking at this, I was like, man, this is cool. If I put a nice flat torque curve in the motor, if I can get my boost from low RPM up through a mid-range, say up to 5,500, then I would have a really nice configuration. So I wanted a 6-second 0 to 60 time. I hope I can get that. And I was thinking, just on my calculations here, that I might be able to get 11 to 12 second quarter mile, which, you know, if you got a car that's above 350 horsepower, between like say 350 and 400 horsepower, and you tune it, you dial it in a little bit, maybe a 12-second quarter mile isn't too unrealistic to think about. This is just calculations based on the vehicle mass and what I figured the power curve of the car might look like. And I'm doing most of these calculations just with Excel. Here's some interesting things. So I started looking at heads. Now, as I started going down the road of building the engine, by this point when I was doing this analysis, I had already sent the engine to the shop. I had already fit the bottom end with all new forged internals. And now I was looking at the top end. I was thinking, okay, well, I'll buy a top end kit, or maybe I'll just go port the heads and I'll assemble them on. So I got the short block from the shop. I brought it back home, and it was sitting here in the garage for a long time, waiting for me to figure out what I was going to do with the heads. Well, the more I was looking at supercharging, and the more I was trying to estimate what my actual compression ratio might be with supercharging, I realized I should get some high flowing heads. If I get heads that don't flow that well, I'm just wasting all that effort of supercharging. Now, Ed Wasserbeck at Wasserbeck Speed Shop told me, hey, your supercharging overcomes all the deficiencies of poor head flow. You could just force as much air through there as you want. And he might be right, but at the same time, that you could get away with building less heat. And if you build less heat, you make a more reliable engine, you make a more powerful engine, and you got boost that's a little bit more easy to deal with. So I was looking for something that had good flow, that was reasonably affordable. I liked the idea of aluminum heads because it would take some weight off the car. And I was aiming for a boosted compression ratio somewhere around 12-1. The compression ratio matters in terms of the head selection because the volume of the compression space in the head determines the compression ratio. And so I ended up landing, you can look here, the fourth most expensive head package was the Edelbrock E-Tech 170, which is the head that's included in the top end kit that I used on this engine. In the first video I made on the engine build, I talked about how everyone told me I couldn't use that top end kit for this engine, and I actually could. That head, in terms of cost and performance, seemed to be the best optimization. I had other options where I could go to. I looked at the World Products SR Torquer 305s, which is a Vortec head that goes on a 305 engine, and the Edelbrock E-Tech 170 is a Vortec style head. So a Vortec style head was really the key, but this ended up being the optimum selection for the heads, and you can see that I was looking for a pretty conservative airflow through the intake and a relatively conservative compression ratio and a relatively conservative valve size. I didn't need to go to too big of valves either, and I have to think about what this was. I think it's your 1.92 inch intake valves and 1.5 inch exhaust valves in this head. And most people think, well, go really big on your valves. I don't need 2.02 inch valves for this engine. I needed something that would flow well. I needed something that was adequately sized for 283. So because the Vortec heads, the World Products SR Torquer 305s were recommended, and they were said to do so well on a 305, and there was some information that seemed to indicate that people put them on a 283, I thought, okay, well, a better flowing Edelbrock aluminum head that's based on the Vortec design should be great for this engine, and it should be optimum. We'll see if I'm right by the time I get it all running. Then I started looking at EFI. So I think I was still a little bit on the fence too about carburetor. I wanted EFI. I always knew I wanted EFI, but I just didn't know if I could afford it. So I started pricing it out. And even back then, this is really cool to see. Even 2 years ago, the kind of kits that you had available to you were pretty darn expensive. And I was thinking, well, could I get it for under $2,000? And at the time, I wasn't sure. The lowest price one I could find was Phytech Go EFI 4 Power Adder 600 horsepower kit. And that was priced at $11.95, and I knew I was going to have to go buy some other stuff, including the tank and pumps and stuff like that. I ended up finally getting the tank and pumps, so that cost is now sunk. But by the time I'm all into EFI, I'm $2,000 into it. I still need to buy the actual throttle body intake for the engine, that main EFI part. So I'm still looking at another $1,000 at least in my EFI cost. But these days, you could see how much it's cost. You can get a Holley Sniper for $9.99. And if you spend well and wisely, you could probably get away with a fully electric pump system for EFI for maybe $300 if it's like a drop-in intake pump, or maybe even with a tank with an intake pump, like the one I got from Tanks Inc. I think that was $280. $280 plus $9.99 for Holley EFI, and boom, you got a EFI system for less than $1,300. That's pretty sweet. So you can see all these different options I was looking at, and I was trying to take in the real cost. What's the real cost of an EFI conversion, not just that nice number that you can get from Holley. So I was wondering, even with all this money I'm throwing at the car, am I going to be able to actually get 400 horsepower? 400 horsepower is kind of my magic goal. I know I'm not going to get much more than that unless I just really crank up the boost and then I start to threaten the integrity of the engine. I thought 400 horsepower would be a nice target that's probably drivable and probably reliable. And so I have some conservative estimations, maybe 350 to 400 horsepower, and I'd really like to have 350 pound-feet of torque from 3,000 RPM up. That pound-feet of torque is really what's going to be nice for driving the car around. I made some conservative efficiency estimations. I made a model on volumetric efficiency based on engine RPM, and I computed the horsepower And you can see that the efficiency is varying with time. I used a few curves that I could find on the web, and I curve fit that in order to get that calculation. And you know, it's possible. It's possible to achieve 400 horsepower. If I get anything over 350, I'll be ecstatic. Now, keep in mind, I am boosting it with the Roadtrex, and assuming the Roadtrex performs as well as everyone says it's supposed to, I could have a very, very nice car. Today, how did I do on price? So I recently ran another analysis because I was looking at engines for the C10. Assuming I can keep that 350 running for a while, I won't be doing an engine swap on the C10. Probably not before I get the Impala done. But anyway, I still wanted to look at it, and I was looking at all my options in terms of LS engines. Check this out. So there are so many different engine options available to you today now compared to what I was looking at 2 years ago. And check out this thing, the LS3, what do they call it? The 376/525. You can get it on Summit. You can get it from Jags. It's GM Performance Parts connecting cruise engine that is often paired with a T56, like a T56 Magnum, or you know, a 4L60E automatic transmission. That thing is an amazing engine, 525 horsepower. If you look on Tom's Turbo Garage, he put one inside a Miata, and it's awesome. It looks like it's factory. It's really great. Just a cool engine. If you buy that, you've got the engine, the transmission, and the wiring included for it. It might still need some accessories. In fact, I don't think it has an alternator, for example. And then you would need to consider modifications to your vehicle for EFI if it wasn't already fit for EFI. And if you're converting to a manual transmission and your car didn't have a manual transmission, you have to think about those extra costs. And you'll probably have to change the length of your drive shaft and some other things like that. But if you look at that all-in cost for that engine, that's the most expensive one on here, about 17 grand by the time you get done with it. It looks like it's really cheap on paper because you look at a Connect and Cruise kit and it's like 8,000 bucks. Or you look at just the crate motor, the 525 crate motor, I think it's like $8,500, which looks like a steal. And frankly, that is. I mean, that's remarkable. Less than $10,000, you've got a 500 horsepower engine. But you have to think about all those extra costs. Where's my Impala on this as it is right now? It's the third one from the right. So remember when I was targeting $10,000? No, I did not make that at all. And it actually freaks me out to see this because I haven't been tracking the cost that closely. And keep in mind, I've spread this cost out over about 6 or 7 years. So, you know, you don't notice it. I mean, you think about you pay a car off. This is like buying a car for. By the time I'm all said and done in this, I was thinking maybe I could have the whole car done for less than $20,000. Actually, at first I was thinking I could have the whole car done and running for less than 10. That obviously didn't happen. If I could get the whole thing running for less than 20 before I even go into a paint booth, that's pretty good because if I paint the car, you know, it'll be worth $30,000, maybe $35,000. Not that I'm planning on selling it. Now, if you look at some of these other things, there's a Pace Performance. Pace Performance is an Ohio retailer. They've got a 350 short block Chevy with a 700 R4 transmission as a crate package with FiTech EFI. The total all-in cost for that to put that in the C10 is about $12,000. So the price of that kit itself is only about $9,000. So you know you have about $2,000 to $2,500 worth of extra stuff. Now look all the way down here on the end. Here's the C10 consideration with an LS motor, one of today's 5.3 liters, an LM7 or similar with a new TH350. Now that would be a pretty cheap option for me if I didn't do anything to modify that engine. If I just plopped it in, I got an EFI fuel tank with an EFI fuel pump for about $300 total. And then I kept the TH350, which it seems silly pairing an engine like that up to a 3-speed, but if I'm just trying to save cost on the transmission and I'm maybe even using my existing transmission, and that way I don't have to play with the drive shaft and I don't have to take all the time messing with that drive shaft, I could conceivably do that swap for about $7,000. But $7,000 is not $1,000. You just hear all this stuff on the web about, oh, I did my engine swap for $1,000. No, maybe that's the cost of the engine and a couple parts that seem critical to it. But there's so much more. I mean, you could see in this cost that if I want to buy the transmission, that's, going to be $1,200. If I don't, okay, take that off the $7,000 price, and now you're down to about $5,800. Pretty amazing to be able to do a motor like that for that much. But you're going to have to get an oil pan probably. You might need to get a wiring harness if you can't use the existing one on the engine, though a lot of them are sold on eBay with the wiring harness as if you could just plug it in, plug and play. And then, considerations for fuel injection and things like that. You might need a new radiator if the radiator won't fit. You might need a bigger radiator in order to accommodate cooling. You might not be able to get away with a fan on the front and have to put on an electric fan, so that's going to be $100 or so. So all these things add up, and I think a lot of people just don't talk about that when they do these swaps, and they say, look, it's so cheap. So is an L swap cheaper? Well, again, look at the cost per horsepower. Yes, down here at the 5.3, and we're talking $14 a horsepower. Remember, my original target was $26 per horsepower. Where did I end up? About $39. So I've spent too much on this already, and that's a little bit silly. I still want for the C10 someday, I'd like some reliability. I don't want to sit there and mess with it every time I'm starting it, trying to get the carb to turn the engine over. I'd like to get as close to 400 horsepower as possible, just like I did for this car. Whatever it is, 400 seems like kind of a good number for me. It's a good performance number, but it's not insane, crazy, lopey cam, like unreliable engine number. It's achievable with today's technology and today's aftermarket stuff, and it's not going to cost me an insane amount of money. It's going to cost me a lot of money, but not an insane amount. I want EFI, I want reliability that comes from that, and I want to be able, for the C10 anyway, I've spent too much on this Impala in terms of time. I want to be able to put an engine in the C10 over the course of a couple weeks, not over the course of 5 years or more, as I've been doing with the Impala. So those are my considerations for that. So someday, LS swap for the C10? Yeah, maybe so. I think I could get to 400 horsepower. You can see, like in these options, these are all kind of hovering around the 400 horsepower mark, except for that LS 376 525 engine, which is a nice number. But all the rest of these, if you're aiming for 400 horsepower, with like a 5.3, you're going to need to at least put a cam into it. And the LS motors really do respond well to a cam. It seems like 60, 70, 100 horsepower even is possible with a cam swap on an LS engine. And that's even keeping it pretty drivable. If you put heads on it too, you could certainly get over 100 horsepower with all that work. But if you do heads and cam for an LS motor, most top end kits I see for that, there's some from Trick Flow and others, they're about $2,800. So you got to ask yourself, okay, I want a cheap LS engine. Well, they get really cheap. They kind of fall off a cliff in terms of price once you get above about 130,000 miles. So you find one on eBay with 130,000 miles on it, and then you throw whatever you get that for, like a 4.8 engine on eBay with 130,000 miles on it, you might be able to get for $900 right now. Then if you put a head and cam on it, a 4.8 can actually achieve over 400 horsepower with the head and cam kit. But that's going to cost you another $2,800. Say you got it for $900, you put another $2,800 into it, now you're $3,700 into this 130,000 mile bottom end engine. I mean, is that really the way you want to spend your money? You could spend a little bit more and say you find, like I've seen 6-liter engines. Here, where is that on here? An LS 6-liter LQ4 or L96 with a 4L80E. If I put a cam into it, I could certainly get at 420 horsepower. The engine as it is somewhere between 320 and 380, I don't remember. But a cam is going to be $300. So as long as you're not doing too much work and taking too much time to do a cam swap on, say, a 6-liter, and you don't have to spend too much money on, say, a displacement on demand delete, it's conceivable that you could get that done pretty quickly and have one hell of a motor in that truck. So that's some things to think about. So back to, this is what I thought. I thought I could get a $10,000 engine and T56 manual swap, and it's more like 40% more than that. So not quite my target, but things always cost as much more and they take longer than you thought, and this is no exception. It costs about 40% more than I expected. I estimate conservatively, okay, maybe I'll achieve 380 horsepower. I could get a 380 horsepower LS swap for the C10 for probably less than $8,000 all in, if I didn't let myself get carried away with a bunch of other modifications. This is the while I'm at it-itis that I have, where as soon as I pull the engine out, I'm like, well, now I got the engine bay clean, so that means I can do the brakes, and then I could do the firewall. Ooh, let's get in here and change the steering. So that's something to try to stay away from, especially for the C10. The C10 is meant to be a usable vehicle. It's not meant to be a project vehicle. I meant for it to be like a kind of tiny project vehicle, like a small, fun, one-day projects kind of car. And it turns out that it's already not that. I've been fiddling around with the fuel system for days. If I assume I have 20% error on that C10 swap, it'll probably be $9,000. So is a $1,000 LS swap possible? I gotta call BS. Yeah, I don't think it is. Unless you get the engine for free and you have to make minimal modifications to the vehicle you're putting it into. Like maybe that vehicle was already equipped with EFI, or you're not using a new transmission or changing the drive shaft. If you're not doing a damn thing to it, maybe even you don't even need to modify the motor mounts that much. Maybe you can have a $1,000 LS swap, but I doubt it. You got to talk about all those extra costs. You got to talk about EFI parts, the accessories. I mean, like all the stuff on the front of the motor. If you didn't pull it out of a junkyard car and you just like are modifying maybe a long block that you found or whatever, you got to think about the alternator, the water pump, if you want air conditioning or not. There's a lot of them that have air conditioning that's kind of mounted low on the LS motor, and so when you try to drop it into old cars, the frame rail gets in the way, so you have to make modifications for that. If you do anything to augment performance, you're going to be throwing $1,000 at the engine, just period. I mean, you spend $300 on a cam, but then you're thinking, well, as long as I'm in here, I'm going to do the timing chain. I'm going to do maybe modify the intake or something like that. So there's all that. And then drive shafts. How much does the drive shaft cost? I don't know. I'm going to need one for the Impala. I've seen quotes anywhere from $300 to $800 to $1,000. So add that onto the cost of whatever swap it is that you're looking at. So to conclude, $1,000 LS swap? I doubt it. Will I put an LS in the C10? Hopefully someday. Did I meet my cheap horsepower target for the Impala? No. Did I meet my timeline for the Impala? No. Will I meet my timeline for the C10? Probably not. So that's the realities of engine swaps. This is David Hill with Solve Fix Build. Thanks for watching. Subscribe down below if you want to watch more videos, if this is your first time watching. Thanks for coming to the channel. I hope to see you again soon.
So it occurred to me in some of these graphs that you might not be able to see them that well because the text is so small. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask down in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks.